Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, a program dedicated to exploring the contributions of Middle Eastern archaeology to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark, Director of the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University, and I'm joined by three distinguished colleagues, also from La Sierra University. Larry Geraty, who is a co-host of the program, president for many years at La Sierra. You're still here, helping in many ways to secure archaeology's presence at the university. Thank you, Larry. Dr. Warren Trenchard, who is a professor of New Testament and early Christianity, and helps graduate students make their way through the HMS Richards Divinity School. And Kent Bramlett, who is an associate professor of archaeology and the history of antiquity, also co-director of the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology.
And we've all worked together in the field.
We have. Mm-hmm. We're thinking in this episode about another one of the letters of the New Testament, the letters of Paul, and that is the ones to the people, to the Christians in Philippi. Any sort of immediate reaction to the book of Philippians, the letter to the Philippians? Anything kind of jump out at you?
I sort of think of it as a happy letter, you know, when I think of Philippians. It's encouraging and positive.
And joyful.
And joyful,
right,
yeah.
Right. Warren, what is it? You are the specialist, okay? do you have these sorts of...
Well, you've all read the letter, and I agree with Larry. I think it is a happy letter. The word joy is prominent in the letter. Paul's letters sometimes are very dense when the issues are complicated. Sometimes he displays anger and frustration and so forth. But in this letter, even though he is concerned about some of the things that these people are facing there, it is essentially a letter of thanksgiving for them. He's pleased that they continue to remember him years after he had been to their community and founded the church there. And now, during his time of difficulty, they have remembered him and sent him a gift, and he's very pleased with that.
I think the most profound way I have experienced Philippians is with a colleague of all of us, Dr. John Brunt. He's been a pastor, administrator, teacher, who has memorized several New Testament books, and in particular Philippians. And when you hear Philippians, I'm thinking of what you said, Warren. When you hear Philippians and you're processing it orally, and you're thinking about, and you're emotively involved in it, it removes all of the theological conflict that people get to nitpicking on some of those terms about Jesus. Was he divine? Was he human? All of those sorts of things. You lose that because this is a happy Thanksgiving letter to these believers. And so experiencing it that way is actually worth, and that's how the Philippians would have experienced it.
And that's how all the readers, or the first recipients, let's say, of these letters experienced them. Because they didn't have their Bibles that they could bring, that they had bought at the ABC or something like this and marked up. And no, they were hearing them for the first time. And somebody had come, bringing the document there, stood up in front of the congregation and read it to them. In fact, Paul, in one of his letters, said, you know, when you get done listening to this one, send it over to your neighbor church, and then get the letter that I sent to them, and you read that as well. You listen to that.
Now, could we expect that in the Roman period, that it's not just a matter of reading, but actually in some ways performing? Wouldn't we expect professional readers with inflections and utilizing typical Greek and Roman literary practices? Wouldn't we expect something of a performance in that process, which would then add to this experience?
Certainly, if there were such people in the congregation, they'd be called on, I'm sure.
Right.
Kent, Philippians.
Well, I concur about the positive message. Paul probably wished he could write letters like this to all of his communities. Perhaps it's worth noting that this is actually a rarity, but I think it's a special letter.
Okay. Well, thanks to Christina Reed at the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology, we have all of these artifacts to explore. And Kent, if you wouldn't mind beginning, you have some textual and ceramic artifacts to talk about?
Right. Well, we do have, again, examples of lapidary inscriptions, that is, texts that are carved into rocks, stones. It would have been a public monument for people to see as they walk by, perhaps a funerary inscription or other monumental notice. Examples of papyri, these would travel well. They also were stored in libraries. People could go read documents. Again, most people didn't have their own, but it was a way that they could communicate with throughout the Roman Empire and beyond in some cases.
Now, with papyrus, I wanted to ask you this question. Is it true that the earliest biblical materials that we have are papyrus, and that in time we have more the kind of the parchment, the fine vellum, and so on? Or do we have a mix going through much of these first decades?
Well, after Qumran, I'd have to ask.
I'm thinking especially about these New Testament letters.
The New Testament books. Yeah, I would think papyri.
The earliest examples of manuscripts of the New Testament, pieces of the New Testament, are all in papyrus. The very earliest that we have is just into the 2nd century, and it's a little piece of the 4th gospel, the Gospel of John, written on both sides. And it's not much bigger than or about the size of this fragment that we have here on the table.
Right. What else do you have, Kent?
Well, this form is called a pilgrim's flask. It's usually sort of lentoid that are flattened, and people assume that it was hung in like a net carrier by one side, but they have a long life. I mean, they began clear back in the late Bronze Age, so well before the kingdom of Judah and Israel had formed, on down to classical times. People assume they carried water, but I think that some very interesting new analysis of residues in some of these have shown that there were actually complex mixtures, including spices and other things. So perhaps more medicinal in content.
Okay. Larry.
Well, right here in the center, we've got lots of different pots, ceramic vessels that are very typical of the time of Paul. This one is interesting because in the neck, it's got a barrier that keeps things from falling in that don't belong there, as well as perhaps keeping the liquid that's there from evaporating.
You could carry it around a bit more easily.
You could carry it around a little easier. This one is interesting because in the kiln, this brushed up against another vessel perhaps and has an indentation, and so when it was baked, it was too late to straighten it out. So we see what happens in the process of getting these made. Some of these are decorated. These slash marks are an unusual type of decoration, but most of this is just common wares that you would find in most any home. Smaller unguentaria, they're called sometimes. They had unguents or precious oil, that kind of a thing. And you would also find in this period glass vessels that had a similar shape, especially in burials. And then a series of lamps that are typical of the Roman period. This one being especially interesting because it has the sign for Jesus Christ on it here in the middle. And it came out of a mold that has the same design here. So
it's very close.
Very close, right.
And lamps, I think, have been, for some period of time, one of your favorite
That's true.
artifacts.
That's true. And they go back to the Bronze Age, where they started out with simple bowls like this, and you would put the oil and hang the wick over the side, but the wick kept getting dunked in the oil, so they decided to make it more specialized, and they would
Pinch
make
it a little bit.
Pinch it for yeah. So it developed over time.
Okay. Well, then let's take a look at some slides and kind of do our typical context, our contextualizing. And we do that with chronology and with geography or geopolitics, and that's what we have here, the Roman Empire and the city of Philippi. Kent, we're looking for the city of Philippi on this map. Where is it?
Way over on the top left side. You can see a yellow box. It doesn't stand out against the light background as well, perhaps, but there it is.
And this on Paul's second missionary journey. And then we also see the same thing on Paul's third missionary journey. A number of these places he visits more than once and comes back.
And the significance of this is that on his first trip, he had spent his time in what we would call Asia, that is the whole continent in effect, but that region especially in the Roman province of Asia. But he, according to the book of Acts, received this vision where he was invited to go into Europe. And so Philippi was one of the first of these cities in Europe that he visited.
And then some chronology. Again, we think about the emperors, the two final ones here, Claudius and Nero, at least the ones during Paul's life and ministry. And on this chart, Warren, we have highlighted Philippians, and it fits into this wider context.
Yes, and it is in a collection written according to this chronology, which is quite reasonably accurate, I think. In the early 60s of the first century, it is assumed that this was the time of Paul's first imprisonment, kind of the looser imprisonment, kind of house arrest imprisonment in Rome, during which he is said to have written several letters. We refer to these then as the prison letters: Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and the letter to Philemon.
Excellent. The basic questions. You are a New Testament scholar. New Testament scholars seem to be thinking about these things, maybe to help us understand the book better, I would say. So what do we know about authorship, audience, perhaps?
We have talked about Paul as author of a number of these letters in the New Testament, and about some of them we've said, if Paul didn't, if this letter was not written by Paul, then he didn't write anything. We said that about Romans and Galatians and so forth. This might not be the level of certainty that we can bring to the letter to the Philippians, but it is quite close to that. So this is generally considered by scholars from most persuasions to be a genuine letter of Paul's to a church that he founded early on his second mission trip and hadn't really been back there, it seems, much, if at all, since that time.
Okay. We will be thinking about these background concerns as we go through the illustrations. And then quickly, Warren, we have an outline here for the letter to the Philippians.
Well, like most of Paul's letters, they fall into the category of pastoral letters. So he's dealing with issues and concerns and, in some cases, problems in the church that, in the particular church he's writing to, that often have some kind of a theological framework or base. And then there are often issues concerning everyday life and behaviors and that kind of thing. And most of these letters, this one included, tend to be divided into these two broad categories: broad theological considerations and very specific behavioral admonitions. That's basically what we have here in this. 1 through 3, you know, even where it says admonitions, this is a lot of theological reflection. Paul's plans and so forth are kind of a bridge work between them. And then the last part of it is primarily his reflection on giving them advice on this, that, and the other thing, and offering his gratitude for the support they've given him.
Is it true that in the typical Greek and Roman period letters, that you want to make your major point by what? Putting it in the middle, or at the end, or at the beginning? Where would you do that? And what does that say about the significance and the primary purpose of these letters?
Well, all things written in that period tended to have the most important things at the beginning or the end. And then you would have, if at the beginning, then there were implications of that were spelled out. If at the end, then there were arguments and developments of the idea that would culminate in the focus near the end.
A number of scholars are saying that Paul's primary purpose was to get them to the end, and typically the greetings, the community building, take care of the squabbles, those sorts of things.
Yes, and inasmuch as these were primarily pastoral letters, as their pastor, even in absentia, he was working with them on behavioral matters, things concerning the community and so forth. So we find these at the end, and therefore, you're right, I think they would rise to a high level of importance.
Right. So we have several issues: slavery, shows up in so many of these books. And we will be thinking about it in Colossians and Philemon as well, maybe even more so.
It's not so much a problem as something just to be assumed, right? That this is typical of the period. Yeah.
So why didn't Paul do something about slavery? I mean, we want to do something about slavery. It's abhorrent to us. So this is the Bible. This is the inspired Bible. How do we understand that? How do we explain that?
Well, historians talk about presentism. That's when you take your current judgments, ethical judgments, and project them on individuals and practices of the past. Now, I don't think that that's always wrong, but we can't write a whole history necessarily doing that. We don't tap into how they were thinking. In the case of slavery, there's a huge range of behaviors that fall into that category. Sure, I wouldn't want to be a slave. I don't think anybody wanted to, but it included everything from abject laborers in the stone quarries to the butler or the footman in rather nice houses, people who were well treated, given wages to live on. Basically, they weren't free to go, but they could live with their families. So there's a huge range.
And slavery was not typically something that was ethnic. It wasn't a whole group of people because of their background or whatever. Slavery often resulted from debt.
Yeah, people going into debt.
Going into debt, could not pay the debt, and so they paid with themselves, in a sense. There was slavery associated with military campaigns, and people were conquered, and groups were sometimes enslaved because of this. But there were provisions within those societies for people to work themselves out of slavery. As Kent says, they could accumulate wealth. Many of these slaves were much more highly educated than the people who were their owners, as it were. And they taught the children. They ran the businesses of these people and so forth.
So for that reason, the estimate that maybe a fourth of the population of Rome were actually enslaved. So that makes sense if one thinks about this range.
A reasonable estimate.
Righto, righto. Okay, so we have some other issues. Again, some of these keep popping up in all of these Pauline letters. We have something about crucifixion in Philippians 2, I guess. And then we have the vices and virtues keep popping up in the different books. Must have been against the background of the vices and virtues of the Roman Empire.
They had lists, didn't they, in the Roman Empire, in the literature of vices and virtues. Yeah.
And we even have dogs mentioned in Philippians. We'll see if we can get to that. Okay, so some basic slides here on slaves. And talk about these, you talked about the range. You discussed the range of things. So what do we have somebody doing here?
Here the slave is reading.
Or reading.
Reading to a master, I'm assuming? Or would this happen educationally to children? Would we see that kind of thing happening with slaves as well?
Tutoring children.
Yes, the literate ones. And we do see this over and over. But this may represent a lot of the activity of people enslaved.
Serving, food preparation.
Yeah, because you have these banquets going on all of the time. So, and this one.
Talk about your little puppy.
Well, that's right, and we have one of the dogs at the bottom here. So, but here a servant is serving.
And it's interesting here, Doug, that you know much more about this than I, but this person who's presumably the slave is so much smaller.
Yes. I think that's it. Well, and also the master here is reclining. Right. This isn't your banquet table. So this is what maybe more like the triclinium, where the slaves would come and serve people as they were lounging.
Wash them and so
Right. And here, I'm not sure what they're doing. The art historians have good
doing the hair, I think.
It could be making up the
maybe
hair
a mirror there
for the person. Excellent. And then circumcision, we've seen this again, and we do have groups that are practicing it. And crucifixion, we've seen this before as we've talked about some of the Pauline letters. Here, it means something, because this is a Roman perspective on the crucifixion. It's an embarrassment. Warren, this letter talks about Jesus moving from high realms to low realms. How is this fitting in with that?
Well, most in the ancient world, in this particular location around the Mediterranean, saw the universe in what we sometimes call three stories. There was the earth, There was that which was above the earth, heaven above, and what was below the earth. And this was, humans lived on the earth. They died, they were put into the grave, but they assumed that they would escape that and in some way get themselves to the heavenly realms. And we talked about this in one of our earlier episodes about the commonality of most of the religions of this Hellenistic period being fixated on how to assure adherents to the religions that they could escape the earth and its clutches and have their soul go to its heavenly destiny. And Paul does not challenge that kind of cosmology, but understands the gospel within it. And I think we have a text here that we're going to take a look at.
We will. That comes back to this very idea, and it's a Philippians idea, and it picks up on it in a unique way. We will come to that shortly. Okay, so families show up. We could have shown this with the Ephesians episode too, because of so much advice to slaves and masters, but families, mothers, well, parents and children, as well as husbands and wives. Okay, the dogs. We have lots of mosaics of dogs, and I don't know if dogs were treasured, if they were feared, but these mosaics seem to suggest they were domesticated quite successfully.
And they use them as watchdogs, obviously, like are done today sometimes.
Right. And the one on the right, it looks like is chained, so maybe you want to stay away from that particular household. Here, more a hunting scene. Okay, what does this one say?
Kaveh, beware the dog.
We have those words in Philippians. And beware of the dogs. Who are the dogs in Philippians?
Well, let's just read it. Paul says in verse 2 of chapter 3, look out for the dogs. Look out for the evil workers. Look out for those who mutilate the flesh.
So we're talking the circumcision party and the non-circumcision. Is that kind of the context we're talking about here?
It would seem that he's speaking to them and warning them about those who would, as a group of Gentile believers, force them into the clutches of Judaism.
So this would be the negative side, the downside of dog life, as an illustration. I have another one. This is kind of interesting with a puppy or a dog sitting on top of the wine barrels as this is being distributed. So now we'll come to some inscriptions, Warren, and come closer to the text we were talking about. And I think this is it. So read it for us, if you would, Warren.
Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So here you have Jesus who was with God. He's in heaven. He's at the high point of the whole cosmos. And he humbled himself and took on the form of a slave, being born in human life. He comes and lives on the earth. So he comes down to the second story of the universe. And then he further humbles himself by taking on the experience of death, an especially hideous kind of death, and goes into the grave. So he's now in the underworld. But that's, Paul here presents this to the Philippian believers and saying, you know, you need to have that kind of humility. You need to have that kind of humility. But that's not the good news. Because the rest of this, you want me to read the rest of this?
Sure.
Okay. In the rest of this, he says, therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven, on earth, and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So that's the good news. So that if you emulate Jesus in his humility, you with him will be exalted above everything in heaven the earth
Right.
and the underworld.
Sometimes we call this the kenosis theory, right?
Yeah.
Using the Greek word.
The emptying,
Jesus emptied himself.
See, that's why I would feel, and I sensed when I heard our friend Dr. Brunt recite Philippians, you're not lost in theological debates about little details. You are swept up into this totally enthralling experience that happens because of this moving down through them and now kind of potential of moving back up through these levels. Terrific. Well, this text also shows up, this passage does, in and on the P46. I like P46. Dates around what? Around 200, something like that?
8200.
AD. And these are the verses that you read initially.
So P46 would refer to what when you're talking about P46?
Ah, yes. Warren, tell us what the P is and what the 46 is.
P stands for papyrus, and we've seen a little example of a papyrus text here. The various biblical manuscripts are classified by either types of material on which they're written, which in this case is papyrus, or the style of letter writing. This is an example of both. It's all written in what we would call capital letters, which is the only letters they used in Greek at the time. Later they introduced lowercase letters, and so the later manuscripts are very often written in that way. This is interesting. Some of these letters, some of these words that have lines across the top, little collections of letters, are what we call nomina sacra. These are, for the most part, sacred names. Christ Jesus is there, and I see the word for God down to the
abbreviated
left
with
in the
that
middle.
line.
These are abbreviations, and the lines above them indicate that. But the earliest of the manuscripts we have were manuscripts just like this.
Yeah. There are other kinds of inscriptions, very generic ones, maybe like the ones from which the artifacts on our table came. And so we have those. Then we have a few architectural and artifactual remains. We'll take a look briefly at some of them. Larry, you have been here. I don't know if the rest, Warren, have you been? And Kent and I, neither Kent nor I have been here.
You know,
so
there are certain important roads in the Roman world that become well known. We know about in Jerusalem the Via Dolorosa, which Christ carried the cross, and this one is the Ignatian Way, the Via Ignatia, and it goes across Macedonia and right through Philippi, this very important city. And so you have parts of the city on both sides that are important to a Roman city in this
We may
period.
not have time to see it, but we do have a slide of part of that roadway. So we have lots of things, and Philippi has been excavated widely and restored widely. So some general pictures covering a lot of the center of Philippi. And then, Kent, we've talked about the Bema in Corinth, but we have one here. And what was it for?
Well, again, public address. An official could come out and speak to the people. And this was where official proclamations would be given or judgments.
Right, we have that. Thank you, Larry, Warren, and Kent, and all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible. We hope this has provided something for you to think about and to increase your faith, and we look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring.